"No man is strong enough for me," said the Apache woman, until she met the cowboy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. In the rugged and untamed land of the American West, where the sun blazed down on the dry earth and the wind howled through the canyons, Nehemina stood tall and proud. She was an Apache woman, fierce and unyielding, known among her people as a protector of the tribe. Her strength was legendary, not just in battle, but in the way she carried herself, proud, independent, and unafraid. In her heart, there was a belief that no man could ever match her strength, for she had lived a life hardened by adversity and shaped by the land. Her tribe had taught her to rely on no one but herself, and that was the way she preferred it. One day, while riding along the edge of her territory, Nehemina's sharp eyes caught sight of a man in the distance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his silhouette was unmistakably that of a cowboy, his horse kicking up dust as he rode towards her. She watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She had seen men like him before, outsiders who thought they could tame the land, but they never lasted long. This one seemed different. He rode with a calm confidence that intrigued her, yet she could not shake the feeling that he was not like the others. When he finally reached her, he slowed his horse to a stop, keeping a respectful distance. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her, but she remained unmoved, her expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," Nehemina said, her voice steady, yet filled with an unspoken challenge. The cowboy didn't flinch. Instead, he tipped his hat, a small gesture of respect, and said, "I'm just passing through. Didn't mean to trespass." There was a calmness in his voice that piqued Nehemina's interest, but she wasn't ready to trust him. "This is Apache land," she replied, her tone hardening. "No one is welcome here unless invited." The cowboy met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. "I don't need an invitation," he said, "but I respect your land." His words were simple, yet something about them stirred something in her, a flicker of recognition, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. For a moment, there was silence between them. Nehemina couldn't understand why, but she felt drawn to this man, even as she fought to maintain her distance. She had no time for men who didn't understand the way of the Apache, and yet, there was something in his presence that felt different. Nehemina knew she couldn't let her guard down, not yet. Her duty to her people came first. As the cowboy turned his horse and started to leave, Nehemina felt an odd sensation in her chest, something she couldn't quite name. A part of her wondered if she would see him again. Little did she know, this encounter was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The days passed, and Royce Barrett continued his journey through the wilderness, but the image of Nehemina, the strong Apache woman, lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter had been more than just a fleeting moment in the desert. His instincts, honed from years of navigating the harsh life of a cowboy, told him that he would see her again. What he didn't know was that their paths were about to cross again in a way neither of them could have predicted. It was a week later when Royce returned to the area, this time with a purpose. He had heard rumors of trouble brewing near the Apache lands, tensions rising between the settlers and the tribes. He knew that if he could avoid conflict, he would. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the pull that had drawn him to Nehemina. His thoughts were interrupted when, while riding along a narrow trail, he heard the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves. He turned to see a group of Apache riders coming toward him, led by Nehemina herself. They moved with the precision and grace of warriors, and as they got closer, Royce could see that they weren't just passing through. Nehemina's gaze locked onto his, her expression unreadable. She did not speak, but the tension in the air was thick. The cowboy and the Apache woman stood face to face once again, but this time, there was no challenge in her eyes. Instead, there was something more, an unspoken understanding. Royce knew that the time for words had passed, and they both stood there, their gazes meeting, neither of them willing to back down. After what felt like an eternity, Nehemina spoke. "You have come back," she said, her voice steady, yet filled with something he couldn't place. Royce nodded. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply. There was a brief silence, and then Nehemina gestured for her warriors to circle around him, their eyes watching him carefully. Royce stood tall, meeting each of their gazes with calm assurance. Nehemina's voice broke the silence again. Why? She asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Why did you return? Royce hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. But the truth was simple. He had returned because, despite everything he had been taught, despite the differences between them, he felt a connection to her. A connection he couldn't explain. I wanted to make sure you were safe, he said, his voice sincere. I know the settlers and the tribes aren't getting along. I didn't want any harm to come to you or your people. Nehemina's eyes softened slightly, but her pride remained evident. You think we need your protection? She asked, her words sharp but not unkind. I don't need your help, Cowboy. Royce felt a pang in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He had known this wasn't going to be easy. No, you don't need my protection, he said, his voice steady. But I would like to offer my help, if you'll let me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their unspoken history. For a moment, it seemed as if Nehemina would refuse him, as she had so many others. But then something in her eyes shifted, something that made her pause. Her warriors, standing in a tight circle around them, seemed to sense the change. The tension slowly began to dissipate. Nehemina took a step back, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. Very well, she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. You may stay, but do not think this means you have earned my trust. If you wish to help, you will prove it. Royce nodded, understanding the challenge. I'll prove it, he said simply. And so, without another word, the Apache woman turned her horse, and the group rode off, leaving Royce standing there, his heart pounding with anticipation. He knew that this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Royce did everything in his power to prove his worth to Nehemina and her people. He helped where he could, even when it meant risking his own safety. He learned their ways, their customs, and their language. And slowly, piece by piece, he earned their respect. But it wasn't just Nehemina's respect that he sought. It was something deeper, something more personal. He had come to admire her strength, her courage, and the way she led her people with unwavering determination. And as the days turned into weeks, Royce realized that what he felt for Nehemina was no longer just admiration. It was something far more complicated. But with every passing day, Nehemina remained an enigma to him. She was strong, fierce, and untouchable. But the more he learned about her, the more he realized how much he didn't understand. And that mystery only drew him in further. As Royce stood at the edge of the camp one evening, watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he knew that his journey had only just begun. But no matter what happened, one thing was certain. He was in this fight for the long haul. Royce was determined to prove that he could stand beside Nehemina, not as a stranger, but as someone who truly belonged. Little did he know, the trials that lay ahead would test his very soul, and the bond between him and Nehemina would be tested in ways neither of them could predict. In the days that followed, Royce continued to prove himself to Nehemina and her people. He worked alongside the warriors, helping with tasks that seemed small but were essential to the survival of the tribe. From mending fences to gathering firewood, he did whatever was necessary without question. Yet, it wasn't the tasks he performed that seemed to matter most to Nehemina. It was his quiet persistence and unwavering respect for the Apache way of life. While Royce spent his days working with the tribe, Nehemina watched from a distance, still unsure of how to feel about him. She could see that he was different from the others who had come to their land. He wasn't here for conquest, and he wasn't here to take what didn't belong to him. But that didn't mean she trusted him. To trust meant opening herself up, and Nehemina had learned long ago that to open oneself to another was a dangerous thing. Still, she couldn't deny the quiet strength he had shown in the past weeks. His actions, though simple, had earned him a place among her people, even if it was a place that was still tentative. Royce, on the other hand, was beginning to understand Nehemina in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was not only a leader but also a protector, a woman whose strength was both her shield and her burden. He admired her, but more than that, he was drawn to her determination. There was something in her, a fire that mirrored his own, a desire to protect, and a willingness to fight for what was right. But it was also her solitude that intrigued him. Despite being surrounded by her people, Nehemina carried a loneliness within her, something that made her hard to reach. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, Royce found himself once again at the edge of the camp, watching the colors of the sky shift from gold to purple. He had learned over time to appreciate the silence of the land, but tonight, he found it different. He wasn't alone. Nehemina approached him quietly, her footsteps almost inaudible in the soft earth. He turned, surprised, but didn't speak. She stopped beside him, her gaze on the horizon. "The land speaks, doesn't it?" she said after a long moment. Royce nodded, though he wasn't sure if he understood her meaning. "It's more than just the earth. It's the sky, the wind, the animals, everything is alive out here." Nehemina's voice was soft, but it carried an unspoken weight. She was speaking not just of the land, but of herself. Royce, sensing the shift in her tone, chose his words carefully. "I know that feeling," he said. "It's like the world is always moving, always changing, and you're just trying to keep up." Nehemina glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You think you understand?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Royce hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe not fully, but I know what it feels like to be shaped by the land, to be defined by what you've survived. It's why I came here, to find something, or maybe to lose something." She looked at him for a long time, her gaze hard to read. "You are not like the others," she said finally. "But that does not mean you are one of us." Royce felt a pang in his chest. He knew she was right. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he learned, he could never truly be Apache. But that didn't mean he couldn't stand beside her. "I'm not asking to be one of you," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I'm here, and I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere, Nehemina." Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a rush of hope through him. She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the horizon, her expression unreadable. But as they stood there, side by side, the silence between them didn't feel as heavy as it once had. It felt shared. Over the following weeks, their bond grew, slowly but surely. They began to spend more time together, talking about their pasts, their lives before the land had brought them together. Nehemina spoke little of her past, but Royce learned that she had once been a child of the mountains, raised by her tribe's elders, learning the ways of survival and honor. But she had also lost much: family, friends, and a way of life that had been threatened by outsiders. Royce, in turn, shared the story of his own life. How he had come to the West in search of freedom, only to find that freedom was never truly his to claim. His past was filled with battles, both external and internal, and he had learned the hard way that not all battles could be won with strength alone. They were both shaped by loss, by struggle, and by a deep desire to protect what mattered most. But as much as they shared, there was still a distance between them, an unspoken line that neither of them dared to cross. Royce knew Nehemina was still holding back, still guarding herself from the vulnerability that came with letting someone in. But he was patient, and he would wait, knowing that the Apache woman had her own way of showing trust. Little did they know, the world around them was about to change in ways they couldn't predict, and the bond they were forming would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. As the days passed, Royce and Nehemina's bond grew stronger. They shared quiet moments together, moments where words were unnecessary, and their connection deepened. They both knew the tension that had once existed between them had started to fade, but neither of them was ready to admit it. Royce's presence had become a part of the tribe's daily rhythm, and Nehemina, while still maintaining her distance, found herself relying on him more than she had ever anticipated. It wasn't just his strength or his willingness to help. It was his understanding, his respect for her people, and his determination to prove himself. Still, the people of the tribe were watching, waiting to see if Royce's intentions were truly pure. Nehemina, as their leader, had to remain cautious. She had seen enough betrayal in her life to know that trust had to be earned. But she found herself thinking about him in a way that was different from any other man she had known. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant oranges and pinks, Nehemina and Royce found themselves alone by the river, their horses grazing quietly nearby. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the sounds of the water rushing over stones created a calming rhythm. Royce sat on a large rock, his elbows resting on his knees, looking out over the water. Nehemina stood nearby, her eyes following the flow of the river. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a comfortable silence, one that spoke volumes without words. Finally, Nehemina broke the quiet. "Why did you really come here, Royce?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, though her tone still held the sharpness of someone who had been hurt before. Royce turned to look at her, his gaze steady. "I came because I couldn't stay away," he said simply. "But I stayed because of you." The words hung in the air, more powerful than any of the physical battles they had faced together. Nehemina looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You think I need saving?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of disbelief and challenge. Royce stood up and stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't think you need saving. But I think you deserve someone who will stand beside you, not behind you. Someone who understands what you fight for." Nehemina felt a flicker of something deep within her, something she had long buried. She looked away, her heart racing. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what it means to carry the weight of a tribe, to carry the weight of a people who have been torn apart." Royce stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "I understand more than you think," he said softly. "I've carried my own burdens, Nehemina, and I've learned that sometimes carrying those burdens alone doesn't make you strong. It makes you broken." Nehemina's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I am not broken," she said, her voice sharp. Royce reached out, gently touching her arm. "No," he said quietly. "You're not. But you don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Nehemina allowed herself to look at him fully, to see the sincerity in his eyes, and in that moment, something shifted between them. She didn't know what it was, but it was real. "I don't trust easily," she said, her voice raw. "And I don't let people close." Royce nodded. "I know. And I'm not asking for your trust. I'm just asking for a chance." Nehemina took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the river once more. "A chance at what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A chance to prove that I'm not like the others," Royce said, his voice steady. "A chance to prove that I'm here for you, and not for what I can take from you." Nehemina turned to face him fully, her heart pounding. For the first time, she saw him not as an outsider, not as a man who had come to take something from her, but as someone who truly cared. "We are not the same," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But that doesn't mean we can't help each other." Roy smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I'm willing to try if you are." Nehemina stood there for a moment, her heart racing, unsure of what to say next. But then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll see what happens." And with that, the unspoken tension between them shifted once more, becoming something new, something that neither of them could yet define. As they stood by the river, the world around them seemed to pause, holding its breath for what was to come next. They didn't know it yet, but their bond was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The trials they would face together would push them to their limits, and the choices they made would determine not just their futures, but the fate of the people they both cared for. But for that moment, all that mattered was the shared silence between them, the beginning of something neither of them could predict. The days turned into weeks, and Royce found himself falling deeper into the rhythms of Apache life, more connected to the land and the people than he had ever been. But no matter how much he tried, he could not escape the looming tension that still hung between him and Nehemina. Their relationship had shifted, but it had not fully transformed. They were still two people from different worlds, struggling to bridge the gap between them. The quiet moments they shared by the river, the small exchanges in camp, they meant something, but there was still something missing. Nehemina, despite her strength and resolve, had a vulnerability that she refused to show anyone. Royce could feel it, deep within her, but she kept it buried beneath the layers of her leadership, her duty to her people. She had learned long ago to keep her heart guarded, and no matter how much she trusted him, she wasn't ready to let go of that shield. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp, the air thick with the scent of burning wood, the sound of distant drums echoed in the night. The tribe was preparing for a ceremonial gathering, a tradition that had been passed down for generations. Royce stood at the edge of the camp, watching the people move with a sense of purpose, their faces painted in intricate designs. He could feel the weight of the occasion, the deep connection they had to the land and their ancestors. Nehemina was leading the ceremony, her presence commanding, and Royce couldn't help but watch her with a mixture of awe and longing. She was everything he had come to admire, strong, fierce, yet holding something back that he couldn't quite grasp. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, Nehemina approached him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with something he couldn't place. Royce nodded, though he wasn't sure what she meant. "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice low. Nehemina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch unexpected but grounding. "The ceremony," she said simply. "It is more than just tradition. It is a test. For you. For us." Royce's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of the ceremonies, but he hadn't fully understood their significance. It wasn't just about participating in the rituals. It was about proving himself to the tribe, to Nehemina. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice tense with anticipation. Nehemina studied him for a moment, her eyes unwavering. "You have to prove that you are more than just a cowboy, that you understand what it means to be part of something greater than yourself, to fight for something worth fighting for." Royce's chest tightened. He had spent his life fighting for survival, for his freedom, but this was different. This was about something much deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He had never been part of a community like this, a people who fought not just for themselves, but for their ancestors and their future. Nehemina turned and walked toward the center of the camp, her steps deliberate. Royce followed her, his mind racing with uncertainty. He had been accepted into the tribe, but this ceremony would determine if he truly belonged. As they stood before the fire, Nehemina began to speak, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Tonight, we honor the land, the ancestors, and the future," she said, her words resonating with power. "We honor those who fight not just with strength, but with heart. Royce Barrett, you have shown your strength, but tonight you must prove your heart." Royce felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what Nehemina meant, but he knew that this was the moment that would define him. The fire crackled loudly as the drums grew louder, the intensity of the ceremony building. Nehemina looked at him, her gaze piercing, and he could see the challenge in her eyes. "Show me your heart," she said softly, almost as if it were a command. Royce took a deep breath. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. He stepped forward, his chest swelling with determination. He didn't know what the ceremony would require, but he knew one thing. He was ready. Ready to prove that he was more than just a man from a distant land. Ready to show Nehemina and the tribe that he could fight for something greater than himself. As the ceremony continued, Royce felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This wasn't just about earning respect or proving his worth. It was about embracing the values that Nehemina and her people held so dearly: the land, the ancestors, the future. It was about becoming a part of something bigger than himself. As the night wore on, Royce stood beside Nehemina, watching as the tribe danced around the fire, their movements fluid and powerful. He had been tested, not just physically, but emotionally. And in that moment, he realized that he had passed the test. He was no longer an outsider. He was one of them. As the days following the ceremony passed, a quiet but significant shift took place between Royce and Nehemina. The tribe had accepted him, and though there were still those who eyed him with skepticism, the ceremony had cemented his place in their world. Nehemina, however, continued to keep her distance. She watched Royce, as if testing him, still unsure if he could truly understand the weight of their way of life. Royce, for his part, didn't mind the distance. He had learned to be patient, especially with someone as strong and independent as Nehemina. But his admiration for her had grown, and he couldn't help but feel that their connection was deeper than either of them wanted to admit. One afternoon, as Royce was helping to mend a section of the fence near the outskirts of the camp, a scout rode in, his horse kicking up dust as it approached. The rider's face was grim as he relayed news that would soon set the course for everything. "The settlers," the scout said, breathless from his ride. "They've been moving closer. They're building a settlement not far from here. They've already started cutting down trees." The news spread quickly through the camp, and soon, Royce found himself standing beside Nehemina, watching as her people gathered to discuss what to do. Tensions between the Apache and the settlers had always been high, But this was different. The settlers weren't just passing through. They were building something permanent, something that threatened the very land the Apache had called home for generations. Nehemina stood tall in front of her people, her face hard with determination. Royce had seen this side of her before, the leader who wasn't afraid to take charge and make difficult decisions. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. "We cannot allow them to take this land," she said, her voice steady but filled with authority. "This is our home. We will not be driven from it." Royce felt the weight of her words, the same fire he had seen in her before, but this time it was coupled with something else, desperation. She was fighting not just for her people, but for the very survival of their way of life. He couldn't help but feel a deep respect for her, and something else, too, a desire to stand by her, to help her in whatever way he could. "What can I do?" he asked, stepping forward. Nehemina turned to him, her gaze piercing as she studied him. "This is not your fight, Royce," she said. "It's ours. You've already proven yourself in other ways, but this is different." Royce didn't flinch at her words. He knew this was more than just a matter of survival. It was about pride, about history, about something that ran much deeper than just land. "I know it's different," he said, his voice low but firm. "But that doesn't mean I can't help." Nehemina looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "We will need to act swiftly," she said. "The settlers won't stop. We have to strike before they settle too deep into our land." Royce nodded. He understood. The Apache had always been a people of action, and Nehemina's leadership would be critical in the days to come. But as he looked at her, something in his chest tightened. He knew this fight would test everything they had, everything they were. As the days grew shorter and the pressure mounted, Royce found himself increasingly involved in the planning. Though he was not Apache by birth, he had become one of them in spirit. The tribe had grown to trust him, and he had proven his loyalty to their cause. He spent long hours alongside the warriors, preparing for the confrontation that was coming. But in the quiet moments, when the camp settled down and the firelight flickered across the faces of the people, he found himself thinking of Nehemina. She was always at the center of everything, commanding respect from her people. And though she had softened slightly around him, she remained a mystery, an enigma that he longed to understand. One evening, as the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the coming storm, Royce found Nehemina alone near the riverbank. The sound of the rushing water seemed to suit the tension in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time had slowed. Nehemina stood with her back to him, staring out at the river, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. Royce approached quietly, unsure of what to say. Nehemina turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "You've been a great help to us," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But this is not a fight you should be a part of. It will be dangerous." Royce stepped closer, feeling the pull between them. "I've been in dangerous fights before, Nehemina," he said, "and I've never turned my back on something I believe in." Nehemina's gaze softened, but there was still something distant in her eyes. "This fight is different," she said. "It is not just about survival. It is about preserving everything we are." Royce reached out, gently touching her arm. "I know," he said, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Nehemina was silent, and then she nodded, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "I know," she said quietly, "and for that, I am grateful." As they stood there, the river flowing steadily beside them, it became clear to both of them that this was no longer just about the land or the settlers. It was about something far more powerful. It was about the bond they shared, the trust that had grown between them, and the future they were both fighting for. Together, they would face the coming storm. Together, they would fight to protect everything they held dear. The night before the battle was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the smell of smoke and the quiet murmur of warriors preparing. Royce stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the horizon. The moon was high in the sky, casting pale light over the land, and the camp was alive with activity. Nehemina's voice rang out as she gave orders, her tone firm and resolute. Royce felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The settlers were close, their presence on the land undeniable, and the tribe had made its decision. Tomorrow, there would be no turning back. Royce had known this moment was coming. He had seen it in Nehemina's eyes, the way she carried herself with the burden of leadership. He had seen her struggle, the weight of her people on her shoulders, and now, she had made her choice. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. The land was theirs, and they would fight for it. He had proven himself to her, and to the tribe, but this was different. This was war. As the firelight flickered in the distance, Royce could hear the quiet murmurs of the Apache warriors, preparing their weapons, sharpening their blades, and readying their horses for the ride ahead. The air was tense, but there was also a quiet strength in the camp. They were not afraid. They had faced adversity before, and they would face it again, together. Nehemina approached Royce, her footsteps silent in the night. She stopped beside him, her presence calm and steady, like the wind before a storm. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of 100 battles. Royce turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "But are you?" Nehemina's gaze softened, but there was no hint of doubt in her eyes. "I've been ready for this my entire life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't make it any easier." Royce could see the burden she carried, the weight of her responsibility, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in her armor. He knew that she wasn't just leading her people into battle. She was leading them into the unknown, into a future where everything they had built could be torn apart. "You don't have to do this alone," Royce said, his voice low. "I'm here. I'm with you." Nehemina met his gaze, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, the tension between them palpable. Then, she nodded. "I know," she said softly, "and that's what makes all the difference." As they turned to join the others, the night seemed to hold its breath, the calm before the storm. The warriors gathered around Nehemina, each one silent, their faces determined. Royce stood among them, his presence now a part of the tribe's strength. He had been accepted into their fold, not just as an outsider, but as one of them. The battle was set to begin at dawn, and they would not back down. Royce's heart beat with the rhythm of the drums that echoed through the camp, a sound that resonated deep within him. This was it. This was what he had fought for, what he had promised Nehemina and her people. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the camp stirred to life. The warriors mounted their horses, their faces painted with the symbols of their people, ready to defend what was theirs. Royce rode alongside them, his heart racing as they moved out, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. Nehemina led them, her posture unwavering, her eyes focused on the land they were determined to protect. The battle began with a roar, the clash of metal against metal, the cries of warriors as they fought for their land. Royce fought beside Nehemina, his body moving on instinct, his mind focused on the fight ahead. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of the battle. The settlers were well armed, but the Apache were fighting for their home, and that gave them an edge that nothing could replace. As the battle raged on, Royce found himself face to face with one of the settlers, a man who looked just as determined to protect his claim as Royce was to protect the Apache. Their swords clashed, the sound sharp in the chaos of the battle. Royce pushed forward, his strength and training evident as he fought. But in the heat of the moment, he saw something that made him hesitate, a familiar face in the crowd of settlers. It was Sterling Maddox, the merchant who had once crossed paths with him. Sterling's eyes met his, and for a moment, everything stopped. But the fight was far from over. Royce's focus snapped back to the battle, and he pushed the thought of Maddox out of his mind. The Apache were winning, but there was no time to celebrate. Nehemina fought alongside him, her movements graceful and deadly, her leadership evident in every strike. The battle was theirs, but the cost was high. As the dust settled and the last of the settlers fled, Nehemina stood tall, her gaze sweeping over the land they had defended. Royce rode up beside her, his heart still racing from the fight. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. Nehemina looked at him, her face calm, but there was a spark of something in her eyes. "We did," she said softly. "But this is just the beginning." Royce knew she was right. The land was theirs for now, but the future was uncertain. The battle had been won, but the war for their survival was far from over. But as he looked at Nehemina, standing tall in the aftermath of the battle, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to face whatever came next by her side. As the days passed after the battle, the mood in the Apache camp shifted. There was a quiet victory in the air, but also a sense of unease. The settlers had been driven away, But Nehemina and Royce both knew that this was only the beginning. The settlers would return, and the land they had fought so hard to protect was still vulnerable. The tribe gathered for a council meeting to discuss their next steps. Nehemina stood at the head of the council circle, her presence commanding respect from every warrior, every elder, and every member of the tribe. Royce stood to the side, not as a leader but as an ally, someone who had earned his place among them. The fire in the center of the circle crackled, the flames dancing in the dark, casting long shadows on the faces around the camp. Nehemina's voice rang out, steady and strong. "We have won this battle," she said. "But we cannot forget that we are still at war. The settlers will return, and we must be ready." There was a murmur of agreement among the tribe. Royce could see the weight of the decision in Nehemina's eyes. She was a leader, but even the strongest leaders could not carry the weight of everything alone. The council discussed their options, whether to fortify their defenses, send out scouts, or strike preemptively at the settlers before they could regroup. It was clear that Nehemina's leadership was not questioned, but the burden of those decisions weighed heavily on her. Royce stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the council. "I have seen what you are capable of," he said, his gaze meeting Nehemina's. "And I will stand beside you in whatever comes next. You do not have to carry this alone." Nehemina's gaze softened for a moment, but she quickly masked it with her usual stoic expression. "You are part of this now, Royce," she said. "But you must understand that the decisions we make will affect all of us, and not everyone will be happy with what we choose." Royce nodded. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I will be here. I won't turn my back on you or your people." The council continued, but Royce could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He had made his choice. He was no longer an outsider, no longer just a man from a distant land. He had proven himself, but more than that, he had chosen to fight for something greater than himself. That night, after the council had dispersed, Royce found Nehemina by the river again. The night was quiet, save for the sound of the water rushing over the rocks. She stood with her back to him, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. Royce approached her slowly, unsure of what to say. He had seen her lead her people, but tonight, she seemed different. The weight of her responsibilities was evident in her posture, in the way she held herself. He stepped up beside her, standing in silence for a moment. "What will we do?" Royce asked, his voice low. Nehemina glanced at him, her eyes thoughtful. "We will fight," she said simply. "We will protect our land. But I cannot do this alone, Royce. I need those who will stand with me, those who understand what is at stake." Royce's heart pounded in his chest. "I will stand with you," he said firmly. "I will fight by your side, for your people and for the land." Nehemina turned to face him fully now, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the river, the wind rustling through the trees, and the weight of their shared silence. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must understand," she said, her gaze steady. "This is not just about us. This is about everyone who has ever lived on this land, about the generations that came before us and the ones that will come after." Royce nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. "I understand," he said, "and I will not back down. Together, we will protect this land." Nehemina's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, but she quickly masked her feelings, her face becoming the mask of the leader once more. "Then let us prepare," she said. The next few days were spent in preparation for what was to come. Royce helped where he could, gathering supplies, strengthening their defenses, and working alongside the warriors to fortify their position. He had become a part of their world, not just in name, but in action. Nehemina remained focused, her eyes always on the horizon, always thinking ahead. The settlers would return, and she would be ready. But it was not just the settlers that weighed on her mind. It was the future of her people, the future of the Apache, and the burden of leadership that she carried alone. As the days wore on, Royce knew that the real battle was not just about defending the land. It was about standing together, about proving that despite the odds, the Apache would not be erased. And for Nehemina, it was about protecting the legacy of her people, their way of life, and the land that had been passed down through generations. It was a fight that would define them all. The morning of the final battle arrived with a sense of inevitability. The Apache had spent the last few days preparing, their warriors sharpening their weapons, their horses well-fed and ready. Royce stood at the edge of the camp, staring out at the horizon. The air was still, the world holding its breath for what was to come. Nehemina was in the center of the camp, organizing the final details of their defense. She moved with the calm confidence that had come to define her as a leader, but Royce could see the weariness in her eyes. She had fought for so long, carrying the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders. And now, the final test had arrived. Royce approached her, his boots crunching in the sand. Nehemina looked up as he neared, her gaze steady. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. "We're ready," she said, her voice calm but heavy with the responsibility she carried. Royce nodded, feeling the tension in the air. "I'm ready," he said, though he knew the battle would test them all in ways they hadn't yet imagined. Nehemina gave him a small nod, the barest hint of gratitude crossing her face. "You've proven yourself," she said quietly. "You're one of us now." Royce's heart swelled at her words, but he didn't allow himself to linger on them. The battle was still ahead. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the camp, and the warriors gathered, forming ranks. The drums of war began to beat, the sound reverberating through the land, and Royce felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood his veins. This was the moment he had fought for, the moment that would decide the future. As the tribe prepared to march, Nehemina took her place at the front, leading them with a strength that Royce admired. The battle would not be easy, but with her by his side, he knew they had a chance. They rode out, the dust rising behind them as they made their way toward the settlers' encampment. Royce rode close behind Nehemina, his heart pounding in his chest. The settlers were waiting, their soldiers lined up and ready for a fight. The tension between the two sides was palpable, but neither would back down. The battle began with the clash of weapons, the sound of steel meeting steel echoing across the land. Royce fought with all his strength, his movements instinctive, his body flowing with the rhythm of the fight. Nehemina was at the heart of the battle, leading her people with precision and grace. The Apache warriors fought with everything they had, their determination unmatched. Royce saw her in the thick of the fight, her sword cutting through the air with deadly accuracy, her eyes focused on the task at hand. But he also saw something else, something that had been there from the start. The bond between them had grown stronger in the heat of battle, and now it was undeniable. They fought not just for the land, but for each other. As the battle raged on, Royce found himself face to face with one of the settlers' leaders, a man he had never seen before. The man's eyes were cold, his expression hard, and Royce knew this fight would not be won easily. Their swords clashed, the force of the impact ringing through the air. Royce could feel the man's strength, but he didn't back down. He pressed forward, his movements swift and sure, and with one final strike, he disarmed the man, sending him to the ground. The settlers' army began to falter, their resolve weakening as the Apache pushed forward, driving them back. The battle was turning in their favor, but it wasn't over yet. Nehemina was still in the thick of it, and Royce couldn't afford to lose focus. He rode toward her, cutting through the chaos, his eyes locked on her as she fought. The battle continued to rage, but Royce knew, deep down, that they were winning. The Apache had the strength, the unity, and the will to fight for what was theirs. As the sun reached its peak in the sky, the last of the settlers surrendered, retreating into the hills, leaving the Apache victorious. The land was theirs, and for the first time in a long while, Nehemina allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years, relief. The battle was over, but the war for their future had only just begun. Royce rode up beside Nehemina, his heart still racing from the fight. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken understanding. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but full of pride. Royce nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We did," he said, his voice filled with awe. "But this is just the beginning." Nehemina looked out over the land, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "But for today, we have won. Today, we protect what is ours." Royce stayed by her side as the warriors celebrated their victory, their laughter filling the air, their spirits lifted by the triumph. But even as they rejoiced, Royce knew that there was more to come. The future was uncertain, and the challenges they would face would be great. But together they had proven that they were stronger than any force that tried to take what was theirs. And as he looked at Nehemina, standing tall among her people, he knew that their journey was far from over. They had fought for the land, for their people, and for each other. And together, they would face whatever came next, united in their strength and their resolve.